My name is Susan McGregor, also a co-organizer and the assistant director of the Tao Center for Digital Journalism, which is helping host the event today and providing the space here at Columbia. We are really excited about this event and sort of getting a bunch of different people involved. We're really hoping that this can be the start of a bit more of a connective relationship, particularly between the journalism community and the digital security, human rights training community, because there's we share a lot of interests, we share a lot of needs, and I think there's a really great opportunity for us to kind of take today as a starting point and sort of help forge some of those relationships. The first thing I'd like to do, however, this morning is to introduce Sheila Coronel, who is the academic dean of Columbia Journalism School. She's also head of the Tony Stabile Investigative Reporting Program here, which is a really fantastic program in investigative reporting that many of we actually have some graduates joining us here today from that program. And she's just going to share a few words with us. She's been working in investigative journalism for a long, long time, and I think maybe better than anyone else in the school appreciates the issues surrounding source protection and why it's so important for the work that we do as journalists. So if you could please join me in welcoming Sheila Coronel.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone. If you don't mind, I will sit here because I don't do very well behind podiums. So thank you for inviting me. I'm glad that this workshop is taking place. I am wearing several hats here. Among the other things that Susan did mention, I'm also on the board of the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a New York-based organization that has done work all over the world to protect journalists. And for the first time in a long, long time, CPJ has actually been concerned not about countries in Africa or Asia where journalists are being killed, intimidated, or harassed, but also about the United States, where we see that journalists are facing increasing pressures because of surveillance of themselves and of their sources. And I'll do a brief plug here. We are currently circulating a petition called The Right to Report. And this is what we are asserting here. We have to protect our sources, but we should also assert the right to report. The right to report includes the right to be able to communicate freely with our sources. And we believe that right is currently being challenged and being curtailed. And I will give you just a few examples. Last year, Der Spiegel reported that the US, our own National Security Agency, had hacked into the internal communication system of Al Jazeera. That's one incident. You know, of course, the recent ongoing case against James Hennrichsen, who has been roped into a prosecution, a criminal prosecution involving the Espionage Act, and being now facing the possibility of a prison term for his refusal to reveal his source in the CIA. It's about top secret CIA program to sabotage Iran's supposed nuclear program. The federal government has sought to compel Hennrichsen to reveal his source for the book multiple times, and so far he has refused and now faces a prison term and contempt charges for his refusal. Journalists have also been searched and interrogated at the border. A few months ago, National Public Radio reporter Sarah Abdurrahman, together with her family and friends, all of them US citizens, were on their way home from a wedding in Ontario when they were detained for 6 hours at the Niagara Falls border crossing, and each of their electronic devices were searched. If journalists cannot secure their devices or their communications, how can they work? Part of our work requires openness, the ability to communicate with everyone. But we cannot do that if government surveillance is upon us. So let's be clear, we're not being naive here. Journalism is a dangerous profession. In my own country, the Philippines, 76 journalists have been killed since 1992 for reporting on organized crime, on corruption, and on insurgency and terrorism. We know these threats, but the landscape of threats is changing. Old-style threats, threats of physical harm, physical harassment, threats even of libel suits have existed for a long time. We know how to deal with these, but we don't know how to deal with the threat of electronic surveillance because we don't know where the threats are coming from. Last night, as I was preparing for this talk, I went on Google Advanced Search and looked at an authorized disclosure of information in the domain .gov. And it's amazing. how many government agencies have specific internal rules and regulations that penalize the disclosure of information. It's not just the agencies dealing with national security, we know that, and if you're a national security reporter, you know you have to be careful, but these agencies include the IRS, the Federal Reserve, the SEC, the Department of Treasury, even Amtrak. Yes, Amtrak. I mean, these laws have existed for a long time. The US Code actually penalizes government employees who disclose without authorization information. That's well and good. There's good reason for the government to protect information because of to protect trade secrets, to protect the privacy of individuals, to protect law enforcers while they're going about their jobs. In the past, these internal provisions have rarely been invoked by governments. That has changed. Many government agencies now, including, as you will see in subsequent panels, the SEC, have investigated the sources of journalists who have, the sources of journalists who have reported critically and accurately, I may say, on these agencies. When I first came here to the journalism school in 2006, the talk was about, are you willing to go to jail for your sources? This was soon after Judith Miller and the investigations where she went to jail, not refusing. And this is still the question that James Risen faced. That question no longer seems relevant because government already knows who our sources are. They are surveilling government employees. We are caught in the dragnet of, if a human rights group is being surveilled by governments and we happen to be interviewing human rights group, then we're caught in the electronic surveillance network. So the truth is that it's no longer the threat of prison or the threat of going to jail in order to protect your sources. The threat is that we don't know whether we are under surveillance and there is no way we can protect our sources. When I started writing about this, I got feedback from people saying, stop complaining, you know that this is happening. Just go and protect yourself. Encrypt your email. Make sure to only talk to your sources in person, put flower pots in the window, go to garages where you can meet with your sources. That is true. We do need to protect ourselves, and I'm glad this conference, this workshop is taking place. But we also do need to assert the right to report. We have the right, we shouldn't give that up so easily and say protection is our default. Even as we protect ourselves, we should continue to say, we have the right to report, we have the right to communicate safely with our sources, whistleblowers deserve to be protected and not jailed. There has to be a sphere of safety, a zone of safety, whereby journalists who are reporting on matters of public interest are able to communicate safely and securely with their sources without the threat of surveillance, jail, intimidation, harassment, etc. So thank you. That's all I have to say. Good luck with your workshop.
Thank you very much, Sheila. And I think that's actually a really good point. We will be continuing to circulate materials today and be making available on the Tao Center's website and other locations additional information, not just about this workshop and further resources and other groups in the city that you can get involved with, but things like the right to report, which I was pleased to become signature 1,000 on about 2 weeks ago. So I strongly encourage everyone to check that out and to sign up and share it with folks. So I'd like to welcome, I got us set up for our first panel, which is really addressing the issue. I think one of the challenges is that, as Sheila pointed out, is that it's very difficult for us to know who is being surveilled and for what. I think that for a lot of us, it's still really unclear the ways in which our information is exposed. And so for our first panel, we wanted to sort of address these issues, looking at how technology works, how the law is structured, and why a lot of the information that we may think is private is very much not, and is highly, highly accessible, not just to the companies that handle our email accounts and phone accounts, but also to law enforcement agencies who seek to gain access to information about our communications. So we'll just take a short pause and invite our panelists up, and then we'll do introductions and get started. Thank you. Where are our other ones? I lost something. All right. I'm going to go find Brutus.
I'll offer you mine again.
Sure.
I was going to say, we're going to yes. Actually, as some of you, as you may or may not have noticed, one of the things we suggested or offered to you all today was to create a pseudonym or a handle that you could use for your name tag today. Pseudonymity is actually a really important part of source protection and security, so we'll have that going for the next minute or so. But I'd like to welcome Jenn Hennrichsen, who is the director of our Journalism After Snowden program. For the year of 2014, the Tau Center has been working on organizing a series of events and resource efforts to sort of address some of the issues raised by the Snowden disclosures and all of the surveillance efforts we now understand are underway. So I will turn it over to Jenn to get us started.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Susan. As Susan mentioned, I am the director of the Journalism After Snowden initiative here at Columbia, and we are looking at the future of the free press in a surveillance state in an age of mass data. And we have a variety of events and research activities throughout the year looking at these issues in particular. But without further ado, I would like to talk about the panel and our great panelists. We have about 45 minutes for this panel, and I really want to hear from the audience your specific questions, and so let's get started. So the topic of today's panel is how law and technology can put your information and your sources at risk. And we have some great speakers. To my immediate left is Aaron Williamson, who is partner at Tor Ekelund PC here in New York, and he advises clients on legal issues relating to software and technology, as well as surveillance and privacy laws. Previously, he was an attorney at the Software Freedom Law Center. Next to Aaron, we have James Vasile, who is a recognized expert in free and open source software. He is the director of the New America Foundation's Open Internet Tools Project and also director of the Freedom Box Foundation. He is also a partner at Open Tech Strategies, which is a consultancy that advises organizations and businesses as they navigate the open source world. And he's also a senior fellow at the Software Freedom Law Center. And now that's actually Runa's. Next to James, we have Runa, who's a privacy and security researcher, Runa Sandvik, sorry. She's also the first full-time technologist at the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and she also contributes to Forbes. She's previously worked for the Tor project for the last 4 years as well. As Sheila mentioned, we're really in a new time for journalists, as all of you know, and it's not just physical safety of journalists that's important, it's really the digital safety of journalists, the information and their sources. And so we're trying to look at, in this panel, really the nexus of technology and law. We know that technology changes rapidly, and the laws are not keeping up by any stretch of the imagination. So we have seen in 2013 the AP being secretly subpoenaed for 20 records of their 20 phone records from journalists. And that happened without any advance notice to the AP whatsoever. And so there have been groups like the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press who have been working with DOJ on revising these guidelines in order to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen again. But then you still have, the DOJ later that year tapped into the email account of a Fox News reporter and to try to investigate, where their source was coming from. So we clearly have a lot of issues at stake here, and we don't really seem to have the legal backing to improve this at this point. So I guess my first question, and I'd just like to open this up to the panel before we then take questions from the audience, but what can journalists do to really communicate safely with their sources in this day and age of metadata, which is data about data? So not your content of your communications, but the who you're speaking with, the time of that communication. It can really reveal a lot about you and your source. So how can journalists go about their daily lives in news gathering and try to protect their sources?
Okay, I guess I can start with that. I think a good first step is thinking about what kind of services you're using every day and what kind of information you're leaving with these services. So are you using Gmail, for example? Are you using Facebook? Are you using Twitter? Do you enable your location when you tweet? All of these different bits and pieces can then later be used to just build a profile about you. It's not just the NSA doing this. There's a lot of other organizations out there that make money this way. I think after that, the next step is then to look at, okay, so I have all of these different bits and pieces out there about me. What can I do to protect or secure each one? Is it encryption for email? Is it maybe turning off your location when you're tweeting? Is it leaving your phone at home when you go for certain meetings or a walk in the park? And then after that, it would be looking at different types of technologies to do these things, and also make sure that you understand these technologies, because it is going to be up to you to inform your source how to actually use these tools and have a secure communication line with you.
Yeah. So everything we do online leaves a trail somewhere. And most of the stuff we do online these days leaves trails in pretty obvious places. Centralized places like Google or Facebook, or obvious places like our employer's email servers, or our own laptop, or our own cell phone. And so if somebody is curious about what you're doing, there are pretty obvious places to look, right? They look at the devices you're using and the services that you're most likely using. I mean, almost all of us are using some subset of the major service providers for communication, professionally and personally. So once you realize that there's, just a basic landscape of places people communicate and things they use to communicate, those are the places where you're going to want to avoid. So if you're using your employer's email service, meaning your corporate email account, to talk about your employer or to talk to a reporter, that's probably a bad idea, right? Because that's the first place they'll look. If you're talking about anything important over a shared service like Gmail, well, all your email is sitting on a box waiting for a judge to okay a warrant, or waiting for an employee at Google to decide it's important enough to give up your privacy. And so whatever you're doing, there's going to be somebody who might have interest in it, and you have to think about who that person is, and you have to think about who your sources are and where they're at, and who might be interested in their communication. So Runa sort of pointed to the services and the technology you're using, and the only thing I would really want to add to that is think about who the other actors are. Think about who your sources are, think about who's interested in their communication, and who might have an interest in what they're saying to you, and who could hurt them if they found out about what they're talking to you about. Those are the people that you have to worry about. And it's going to look very different if the person you're worrying about is at the NSA, or is at their employer's office, or maybe it's just their parents, right? If you're talking to juveniles, or maybe it's Amtrak, for all we know, as we heard earlier. And figure out who are these people that would be interested, and how do they interact with your source, and how does that person avoid using technology and means that spying entity might have access to. So that's sort of the big bit of analysis that you have to do. You put a little bit of thought into that, and then you end up using an obvious list of things that are designed to anonymize you and hide your metadata. There are really easy to use tools out there now. The Tor browser, which Runa has a lot of experience with, is really good these days. If you Google Tor browser, man, you can do a lot with that. Read about what it does and what it doesn't do, but it'll give you a lot of anonymity. Cryptocat is perfect for just typing messages to another person and have them type back. If you want to do that in a fairly anonymous way, in a fairly untraceable way, Cryptocat's pretty good for that. Text Secure, which you can put on your Android phone, is really good for sending text messages that only you can read and the person you're sending it to can read. There are good tools. If you have need of these tools, talk to the people on this panel, talk to Susan, talk to Sandy. There is a list of tools that have gotten pretty good and pretty usable in the last few years. Technology has gotten better, and we really have no more excuses not to use some of it. Sources need our protection, and I think we have an obligation to give it to them. So that's all I'm going to say, because I don't want to take up too much more time.
Right.
I agree that the first thing any journalist can do to better protect their sources is to learn about and start using technologies that enable privacy and communications, and that's what the workshops at the end are about. And I think it's a really excellent service that those are being held. What I would also encourage every journalist to do is to become an activist for your rights under the law, because not like all of the laws that we're talking about that enable surveillance of your data and of your sources' data are in flux. None of them are settled forever, and a lot of them are in a state of rapid change right now. I think there is, there's agitation for reform of ECPA, which is the law that permits the government to warrantlessly access metadata and to, with a warrant, but without notice to you, access the contents of your communications. There are other areas, for example, the federal shield laws. The DOJ has encouraged Congress to talk about, has signaled its enthusiasm to work with Congress on writing a federal shield law for reporters, because right now, to a large extent, whether the DOJ exercises restraint with regard to your communications depends on whether they follow their own internal policies, which are not binding, and don't create any cause of action if they violate them.
Discretionary.
Yeah, and things like border searches and whether you're required to turn over encryption passwords in response to an investigation, or whether that's protected by the Fifth Amendment. These are things where the courts of appeals are disagreeing, and where there's real possibility for either new laws to be made or for the law to change in the courts. And so understand what's happening in the law and become an activist for laws that better protect you and your sources.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add something to what James was saying about thinking about the information that you have and who might be interested in this information. And I think sometimes it can be really difficult to even begin to understand what the threats might be or who might be after the information you have, or even the fact that the information you have can be considered sensitive. So I think one way to look at it might be think of all the bits and pieces of information that you have, whether it's a project you're working on or a story or something like that, and just think about how you would feel if this suddenly went on Facebook or on Twitter and was out there for the world to see. How would you feel about that? And I think that might be a good first step to figuring out what kind of information you want to protect and how you're going to protect that.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, that this stuff is difficult. We need more information spreading. We need more folk knowledge around this stuff, but I think we also need more places where expertise and help can be gained pretty easily. Now, you're at an organization that does some of that, but like right now, I think people are starting to build that capacity, and so we need more of that as we go forward. Yeah.
Before we open it up, I'm curious, Aaron, if you could talk a little bit more about the legal landscape and how journalists can become their own activists in making sure that these laws do better to protect them and their sources.
Sure. Sheila mentioned the AP phone records case, and I think that is a case that should be is of grave concern to any journalist operating in the U.S. right now. It was an extremely broad subpoena issued secretly because to access phone records, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which is the federal law governing when surveillance orders can be made domestically anyway, permits the government to seek, as you referred to earlier, metadata, including like the name and address of a subscriber to a phone service, long distance, I think really not even just long distance, calling records to and from a number, that sort of thing, anything but the contents of communications, essentially. They can access those things with an administrative subpoena, which doesn't have to go before a judge and is not subject to the probable cause requirement. So in that case, they were investigating a leak that was reported on by AP reporters. And AP didn't find out that their information was subpoenaed from Verizon and other other wireless providers until months after it happened, because the DOJ's internal guidelines, which it says it complied with, doesn't require it to reveal that until much later. So that's an area where those guidelines, I think, could be supplemented by a real law that's actually binding on the government that says that either they can't do that. I mean, we would have to reform ECPA in order to make that happen. So or a shield law that sort of supplemented ECPA. What else can I tell you?
I've heard from some journalists as well as lawyers that, I mean, because of the excess of metadata that, journalists leave everywhere as they go about collecting information for their news articles, that, a reporter's privilege or a shield law wouldn't even protect them in that circumstance. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, certainly. I'm talking about a hypothetical shield law that doesn't exist, so it could, it could, depending on how it was drafted. But no, I mean, traditionally, shield laws protect journalists from revealing their sources, right? And when you use a service like Gmail, or you make phone calls using your Verizon wireless phone, then essentially, from the government's perspective, you've already revealed your source, right? I mean, James Risen's feet are being held to the fire to reveal his source in the CIA leak case, but we know who his source is, and it was Jeffrey Sterling, a former CIA operative. The question is whether he will be forced to testify that Sterling was in fact his source. So to prevent that situation where the source is already outed by your phone records and your emails, essentially all you can do is use communications channels that don't leak the information about who you're talking to, and that means using encryption. But it also might mean using something other than email and telephone to communicate with your sources, because those, of course, leak metadata.
James, did you want to add to that?
So, metadata is the thing that will catch you every time. The amount we can tell about what you do and who you're talking to and what you're talking about just from knowing who and when is huge. I mean, law enforcement relies on it to build maps of organizations and to suss out hierarchy, to identify terrorists. We have enough faith in the metadata that even without the content of the communication, the United States carries out what are known as signature strikes. Those are drone strikes, right? We kill people based on metadata. The signature in signature strike is the metadata signature. So this is powerful stuff. And if you're giving it up by encrypting the content of your communication, but then sending it over email where everyone can see who you're talking to, when you're talking to them, and what the subject line of the email is, then you've already given up a lot of the information that people need to identify your source, as Aaron pointed out. There are alternatives, right? There are services that will let you communicate without leaking this metadata. You need to use them. The hard part is teaching your source to use them, right? Because your source is going to be a person who knows how to use email, but doesn't necessarily know how to do any of these other things. And so you not only need to be good enough at using this stuff that you can use it, but you need to know how to use it well enough to talk to somebody and figure out what's appropriate for them to use and then tell them what to use, because your source is not going to have this expertise. So that's a hard problem. But I mean, that's one of the reasons why you're here, is to learn it well enough that you can actually have that conversation. In my experience, when I talk to journalists, there isn't a lot of negotiation with sources over means of communication. Most of the time, you just use the default. And that's sort of the standard that is going to have to change if we're actually going to provide real protection to people that includes more than just encryption, but actually protects their anonymity as well.
So just to make this problem even more difficult, and I don't even have the answer to this, but maybe James can comment, is let's say that you have a source, you want to send an encrypted email, and you at this point know that you should not use your employer's email or Gmail. But how do you communicate to your source that not only should you encrypt the email, you should also use a different email service? How do you establish that initial conversation without revealing metadata or even content at that first step?
Yeah, so the thing is that we're asking people to do an awful lot of things that they've never done before. And we're asking people to think about an awful lot of things they've never thought about before. We're at the beginning of a change in literacy around these topics. And that's why we're all here today, right? We're all here to share knowledge and to increase the amount of sophistication about this just among the people in this room. And as we get better at it as a profession of journalists, and I shouldn't say we there, I'm not actually a journalist, but as we all get better at it as a group of people working on this problem, we're going to share that knowledge, and we're going to share that knowledge outside of our narrow niche. And people will get better at this generally. We're not going to solve this problem overnight. This is a thing that's going to take a lot of figuring out, working it out, adjusting best practices, adjusting ways of communicating it to sources, and then some sources will come with some of that knowledge as well, because it'll be in the culture. We need folk knowledge, and that's knowledge that gets passed hand to hand and becomes part of the background noise, right? We all know how to use smartphones. Smartphones are actually really hard to use, but we all learned how to do it, and now we take that knowledge for granted. We're going to take some of this communication security knowledge for granted too. Not today and not tomorrow, but soon. People will start doing this stuff as a matter of course, in the same way that teenagers don't talk about stuff on Facebook anymore because their parents might hear it. They'll adjust. They'll
Please
start
don't use
using other
Snapchat.
services. Right. And I'm not saying we'll all make good choices, but we will make choices and we will share knowledge on how to have our communications in private ways. And we'll get better at it over time, but we're not going to do it overnight.
I guess I can just add that even as a technologist who's been working on this for many, many years, even I make mistakes sometimes, and it's going to happen at some point, and I think the important part is talking about it and actually learning how to use these tools in a safe environment so that when you really do need them, you feel more comfortable using them.
But then how do you respond to concerns that journalists have that using encrypted communications or using anonymizers like Tor might flag them to law enforcement because they are trying to hide the content of their communications? What do you say to them?
I mean,
It's a really
I have a thing to say about that.
Excellent.
Which goes back to my my activism angle, which is that using encryption is activism. It's standing up for your right to keep your communications private. You lock the door on your house. There's no reason that you shouldn't lock the door to your emails as well. And the fact is that, unfortunately, currently encrypted traffic is conspicuous right now, but it doesn't have to stay that way. As encryption gets built into more and more of the ways that we use communication, as more of us stand up and begin using encryption in our day-to-day activities to protect all of our communications and not just the sensitive ones, then encrypted traffic starts looking like the noise and not the signal.
And it's not just activism, though. I mean, if you ever try to do something in a crisis when you really need it and you've never done it before, you're gonna screw it up. Like, if you think that you might ever need security or encryption at any point in your professional life, you should probably start using it a little now just so that you know how to do it, right? I mean, that's just practice, if nothing else. You know, you gain a little bit of privacy and that's great, but more importantly, you learn about your tools and you learn how to be a better journalist who can actually provide effective protection to sources. So there are so many good reasons to take even small steps. And there are a lot of small, relatively painless steps you could be taking right now that you should just start doing it. Just a little bit, dip your toe in and see what happens. It might not be so bad.
So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. We have a little less than 15 minutes. If you want to go to either one of the mics so we can capture it on the live stream, that would be ideal. Does anyone have a question?
Yes. A lot of questions, but I'm happy to add some flavor and color. I'm actually the AP attorney who handled the DOJ phone records matter, and we've been working on the DOJ task force with a bunch of other folks from other media entities to work on the revised guidelines. What was really troubling about the AP DOJ phone records matter was not only what you mentioned about the overbreadth, but also the secrecy. Also the secrecy of the way they did it. And what the DOJ used as a basis to try to bypass notice in our case was it said that the guidelines have a provision that allows it to bypass notice if notice would impact the integrity of their investigation. And what it argued was that just by giving notice to AP about the phone record subpoena, the leaker would know about the investigation, and the leaker would use that opportunity to trash his or her records or whatnot, which is just ludicrous when you think about it, because the fact of the investigation was already public. So the whole theory that the DOJ rested on its case was just really specious. I will say that the guidelines are stronger now as a result of this whole incident. We've been working with the DOJ, and it's not foolproof. They still do have the ability to bypass notice, but it's a little bit harder now, or a lot harder, I should say. I'll make one more point, which is that I think it's important when you're working in an organization to realize that using a third-party provider like Gmail or someone else for your email will be less secure than using your company's email, because at least then it resides on the company's server, and the company has the ability to know if the government is trying to seek those records and has the ability to try to move to quash it, which, we didn't have that opportunity.
So actually, just to respond to that, what do you do then when the news organization, as an entity, uses Gmail as its main email?
I think that's troubling. I really do. And some companies use it. I'm sorry?
I said, yeah, don't do that.
But so many organizations do.
But then you don't have control over it anymore.
Right.
So to the point that was raised, if the government seeks to subpoena Google for its records and it comes with a gag order, or if they seek an NSL, a national security letter, which comes with a gag order, there's nothing the media company can do about that. They just won't know.
And the AP was running its own email server, am I right?
Right, but in the AP case, the emails weren't touched. It was just the phone records.
Right, but that might be one reason why they weren't touched.
Right, and if they were seeking AP's emails, we would have known about it, so at least we would have had the opportunity to go to court and assert our rights to try to quash it.
Yeah, if your corporate email is provided by Google, then you can be betrayed by both your corporation and Google, which is not a great position to be in. And if you're running a company, don't choose Google as your email provider. It's a really bad idea from a privacy point of view.
Other questions or thoughts? Yes. Susan?
And then we'll get yours. Go ahead.
I'm on. Okay. So I do workshops setting up some of this tech for people, and I think education is, of course, a big part of what we're here for. One of the things that I'm struggling with a little bit is that some of the tools are getting very good, right? So CryptoCat is really easy to use. And I think it raises two sort of problems, which I'd like to ask about. The first one is CryptoCat, when it first started, wasn't very trustworthy, right? And it had some problems, and they were called out on it, and they fixed them, and it's great, right? But when people were using the tool then, they could have been exposed in a couple ways. So that's the first problem. I sort of worry about making things too button-click easy for people. The second thing that I worry a little bit about is when a new service comes along. So, for example, this new social network, LO, got a ton of press, right? And there's no reason anyone should trust them or should have trusted them, right? But they made a good promise, they got a lot of press, and trying to separate that out, I got a lot of emails about it, got a lot of people talking to me about it. Trying to separate that out, it's like me saying, well, why don't you trust Sean instead of Elo? So how do you know sort of how to balance that when you're talking to anyone, a professional, a source, et cetera?
Well, I'd like to address the CryptoCat thing just because we worked on that. So the ways in which CryptoCat was problematic at the beginning was that it was buggy, right? All software can be buggy. Whatever security thing you're using, if it hasn't been around that long, maybe those security bugs haven't been shaken out. And so you should wait. Don't use the thing that just popped up yesterday and trust its security. Wait a year, maybe wait 2. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that none of the ways in which CryptoCat was problematic were related to the fact that it's easy to use. So the fact that it was easy to use for people was not the thing that was betraying them. And so your concern about it being too push button, there you go, doesn't really connect to the insecurity. And so I wouldn't avoid things that are easy to use. I would embrace them. They're going to work as well as the experts who made them did their job. And those experts will occasionally make mistakes. But because we do everything as free and open source software, we hope those bugs will be found. And you know what? CryptoCat is a controversial enough project. There are enough people with knives out for that project that they're going to go digging for the bugs, which is good, right? We all benefited from the fact that some guy got really angry and ranted about the bugs. By the way, I love that guy. I thanked him. So that's the thing about CryptoCat. Don't be afraid of things that are easy to use. That doesn't mean that they're less secure. As far as who to trust, should I trust Ello or should I trust Sean? You know, we all have to make decisions about who we trust. I would suggest that trusting companies run by people you've never met and backed by venture capital funds is not the smartest move from a trust perspective. Trust has to be earned. Your friends earn trust over time. They have expertise, you have some way to evaluate it, you have to make the best decision you can make. Personal relationships are good. Don't trust companies to have your best interest at heart, because they don't, right? If your trust and their business model line up, that might be great today, but they might not line up tomorrow. So you have to wonder, who do you trust? You make the best decision you can make. I tend to put my trust in my friends because they have proven it over time.
Thanks.
I would also say look to organizations that have a proven track record that are pointing out and working on the tools that are useful for protecting your information. So look to the Freedom of the Press Foundation, for example, which vets and also funds development, I believe, of privacy protecting tools. Other organizations like that, the EFF will occasionally comment on technology as well. There are organizations out there that are doing the work to identify the tools that are really useful for this purpose. And if you don't hear them talking about a tool, then don't use it.
And when those people criticize a tool, you should probably take them seriously.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, this is a question on the other end of the technology spectrum. But if you have to make phone calls, from a legal standpoint and from a technology standpoint, are there relative advantages and disadvantages of using landlines?
Versus?
Cell phones.
Not really. I guess, so one relative advantage of using a cell phone is that now we're beginning to see tools that enable you to make encrypted phone calls and send encrypted text messages. So the software Signal, which is called Red Phone on Android, and TextSecure allow you to make encrypted calls so that the contents of your phone calls cannot be tapped. Both, call records for landline phones and for cell phones can be obtained by the government using essentially the same process. And so the only, I guess, one other thing I'll say about cell phones is that it's possible it's been possible for quite some time for the government to obtain your location using cell site data. So when you walk around with a cell phone, it is constantly communicating with the towers nearby to basically say, what tower am I associated with, et cetera. Other towers can see your phone, and that data can be used to triangulate your location and place you in an area. So for example, if you're meeting with a source, the tower data could tell the government, that you were there and that you were likely meeting with somebody in this area, and use that to identify your source. So cell phones have that disadvantage. Now, of course, you're calling from your landline. They know exactly where you are because you're calling from a phone inside your house. But that's another reason to be concerned about taking your cell phone everywhere you go and leaving it on.
Yes, Susan.
I'm the plant here. I'm wondering, one of the things that came up that I think is really relevant and a lot of professional journalists have seen happen, which is that for whatever combination of usability and cost saving, we are seeing organizations move to essentially third-party services. They're using Gmail for their internal email, et cetera, et cetera. And I see this from maybe the technology side, but also from the sort of legal, political side, what can organizations, journalistic organizations, be doing? I mean, if you were to make 3 recommendations to the CEO of a major news organizations about better ways that there are things to institute, policies, technologies, et cetera, for their organizations to better protect the records and reporting of their journalists, what would you suggest to them?
I would say number 1, host your email yourself. Number 2, make sure that all staff get training in digital security tools and source protection. And number 3, I would say use SecureDrop, which is this open source whistleblowing submission system that's developed by Freedom of the Press, where it allows journalists at news organizations to safely and anonymously accept documents from sources.
So when we put all our information on these third-party services, we're essentially centralizing the entire world's email at Google and Yahoo. We've built systems that are one-stop shopping for all our data, right? We made the Costco of spying. And every agency in the world wants a Costco card. Don't put your data in the store where they go to shop for data. And that goes for email, that goes for VoIP, that goes for back-end storage, cloud services. If you're a major news organization, you can afford to do this internally. And maybe the major news organizations should get together and make their own stack of services, I'm not sure, so that they're not dependent on this stuff. But don't use the major service providers if you can afford to avoid it. So that's the first thing, just as Runa said, don't use that stuff. Second thing is, I'm a fan of VPNs. If you have people traveling with laptops, it's the cheapest route to two-factor auth for all of the services you might be providing. Relatively easy to set up, relatively easy to use. The third thing is get a professional to come to your organization and tell you how to do this stuff well. If you're at a major news organization, there is nobody within your organization that actually has the requisite expertise to do this well, most likely. Get a professional who knows how to do it, to do an audit, to look at your communications, to see how you're actually doing business, and to give you detailed and tailored mechanisms for protecting what you're doing. You don't need every single communications channel to be secure, secret, and anonymous. You just need a couple of them to work really well and people to actually use those when they need the protection, when they need the secrecy. And so if you can identify what those key modes of communication are and protect them, you could probably get buy-in and probably get people to actually use it way better than you can get people to use an entire new stack of software and tools. So that's where I would start out.
I agree with them.
I had a quick question.
Okay.
At my news organization, they use Dropbox as a way to transfer documents, mostly between reporters, especially if it's cross-border and they're working in a country that's dangerous to work in for journalists. How secure is that? Should we be using, another system?
That's
Yes.
not secure. You should use something else.
Yeah, right, and the other options, one way is to set up your own solution where you're sending encrypted, you want encryption, and you want encryption to happen end-to-end, which means that it's encrypted when, from the place where the file is sent and decrypted wherever it's received. And it's impossible to have end-to-end encryption with Dropbox right now, although they might be working on that, I don't know. They probably are getting some push to do that. But I'm not sure that there is a really, there's certainly not anything as easy to use as Dropbox that will allow you to do that, unless you're just using Dropbox and encrypting the files.
Yeah.
But
What about Spider Oak?
Spider
Yeah.
Oak is probably the closest thing in terms of ease
Spider
of
Oak.
use and gets you an increment in security that's worth getting. BT Sync, the BitTorrent sync, isn't terrible, but it doesn't actually do cloud storage unless you set it up in a certain way. So there are other options. Don't use Dropbox.
And I guess I just want to add that there's something called OwnCloud. So if you do
Yeah,
have the ability
definitely.
to host something yourself, OwnCloud seems to be, I've been testing it out for the past couple of weeks, seems to be a reliable option. So you can host it yourself, so the files are at least still on your property and not Dropboxes when they're transferred between people.
Yeah, that's another example of the third-party service that, you know, you should avoid if you can, right? Dropbox.
Yeah.
One question. I work for Human Rights Watch. I'm the head of their IT. For us, what we're looking at, basically using the cloud but encrypt separately. So we're looking at a company called Vaulted. Basically, you hold the appliance in-house. You create your own keys, but then you use the cloud and everything goes to the cloud. It's encrypted. So if Google or Microsoft get subpoenaed, it's only gibberish there. They must come to you through to get your own key. And that would allow the whole staff to not think about encryption because everything you do is encrypted. So what do you think of that solution?
So I wouldn't say that is just gibberish. They would get the encrypted information, they
Yes.
would get the metadata. And if they're able to break the encryption or guess the key or steal the key or subpoena the key, they would also have the unencrypted data.
If we're
from this
holding the
provider.
key, like if you have the data in-house, they could come to me now and subpoena me for the information, and I may have to give them or not. But if you're holding the key with using the AES 256 or whatever you encrypt using open source, what would be the difference? If whatever you're putting at Microsoft or Google is encrypted, because if you don't give the staff that option, they're gonna be using it without encryption. So maybe you can look at it and then reach out to me and assist me separately.
Yeah, so I haven't looked at that system specifically, so I can't comment on it specifically, but the basic scheme of putting your stuff on third-party servers and then encrypting it while you hold the key is not a terrible idea. I mean, putting it at a place like Google or Microsoft is the hard part, because Google and Microsoft provide great services and, you know, they're set up to do things well, but they're also shops where they've got a lot on the line, and they're never gonna stand up for your rights. And so if push comes to shove, they'll give up your encrypted data, certainly. They'll give up whatever metadata there is, certainly. And then all they need to do is, you know, find a way to get the key out of you, either through a warrant, a subpoena, or through extrajudicial means.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, go ahead. Oh, we have a question up here in the front.
Real question.
And then we'll need to probably wrap.
We're at a moment where Apple's and Google's announcement that they're going to default encrypt the information on your phones without a backdoor is provoking a lot of pushback and calls for a golden key held by wizards to unlock, a magic key to unlock the information on your phone. So I wonder if you could comment on the risk that strong encryption might provoke, you know, being used in a wider sort of sense than it's currently used might provoke a backlash from law enforcement and from Congress and ultimately endanger the tools that we're talking about now.
This is not a new idea, right? You know, when Al Gore was a senator, I guess, he proposed something called the Clipper chip, which was the same exact thing, right? The FBI would hold the keys and we would everyone could have the encryption they wanted as long as with a warrant we could decrypt it whenever we wanted to, or the government could. And the reason that failed mostly was that it wasn't really palatable to the finance industry to have their security undermined. And that's because at the time, the finance industry was sort of the big place where encryption was the thing. And now encryption is in more places. I mean, every time you use your browser and do your online banking, there's encryption there that you're relying on to keep your stuff secret. The notion that we're going to weaken those protections and put everybody at risk for failures in the system of managing the golden keys it's sort of ludicrous to put our entire society at risk and to deprive ourselves of the benefits and the utility of having access to reliable encryption, all for the sake of some notion of, you know, the FBI being able to actually use this stuff properly. I don't think it'll happen. I think what's going to happen is push will come to shove, and people will realize that destroying everybody's security for some fanciful benefit is not worth it.
Yeah, I think that individual encryption that you as the user control, that nobody else has the ability to unlock, is essential to privacy in the digital age. So if we give that up, we're giving up the whole game. So I think that, you know, giving up a little bit now so they don't take more later is I think not the right approach, because it will just inevitably lead to essentially no security or the illusion of security. And so I think what we have to do is take advantage of the fact that right now the voices against widespread surveillance are very loud and the government is on its heels. And I mean, James talked about the Clipper chip. That was hardly on anybody's radar at the time that it happened, and it still got defeated. And so we can win again now, but we just have to keep fighting.
Yeah, there's also this saying that goes, if you build it, they will come. So if you do enable someone to just decrypt all of this information, then law enforcement and others will find a way to abuse that.
Right, we've never actually built a database of any kind that was designed for a limited purpose, where the purpose didn't get expanded. You know, every law we've ever had that has been designed to address a limited problem, like say terrorism, right, has been expanded to address many other problems. So whatever limited purpose that they promise us these keys will be used for, we know that 5, 10, 15 years down the line, that's going to be expanded to include just about any piece of data that we send anywhere that somebody might have an interest in. The last thing I want to say about this is just that if, you know, if they outlaw encryption, only the outlaws will have encryption. Because the bad guys will just not use the government's encryption service. And so we're not actually going to get any of the security benefits of doing that. So we should oppose it quite stridently. Thank you.
All right, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.